The intersection of endurance sport, health, fitness, and life. Challenging conventional ideas and empowering people with the science of self-propelled motion. This is the Endurance Experience Podcast, hosted by Tony Rich.
Today we're going to take on the topic that has gotten a great deal of press in the sports world in the last couple of weeks, which is the recent Court of Arbitration rejection of an appeal heard by the South African 800-meter runner and Olympic gold medalist Caster Semenya. She is what is described as a DSD athlete. You'll hear me use that term in the podcast. DSD stands for Disorder of Sexual Development. Some prefer the term intersex or hyperandrogynous. So I'll use these terms interchangeably to describe a female athlete that may have an XY chromosome or higher levels of testosterone when compared to the normal distribution of the range of testosterone generally appearing in women. The Intersexed Campaign for Equity estimates the population of intersex people to be approximately 1.7% of humans. So the International Association of Athletics Federations ruled that DSD athletes take medication or have surgery to lower testosterone levels. The ruling was challenged and subsequently rejected. So that means that given that the ruling applies narrowly to the events that Caster Semenya runs, she has a couple of options ahead of her, and we go through those options and the chronology of events. Now, to complicate the matter even further, the World Medical Association issued a statement to doctors that off-label use of testosterone blockers is unethical. So I'm going to read this. I'll read part of the statement. I'll link the full statement in the show notes. But this is the more pivotal part of the statement. It reads: At its council meeting in Santiago, Chile today, the WMA demanded the immediate withdrawal of the regulations. It said they constitute a flagrant discrimination based on the genetic variation of female athletes and are contrary to the international medical ethics and human rights standards. Following an initiative by South African Medical Association, the WMA fears the regulations would constrain the athletes concerned to take unjustified medication, not based upon medical need, in order for them to be allowed to compete and accordingly require physicians to prescribe such medication. It is in general considered as unethical for physicians to prescribe treatment for excessive endogenous testosterone if the condition is not recognized as pathological. The WMA calls on physicians to oppose and refuse to perform any test or administer any treatment or medicine which is not in accordance with medical ethics, and which might be harmful to the athlete using it, especially to artificially modifying blood constituents, biochemistry, or endogenous testosterone. WMA President Dr. Leonid Eidelman said, "We have strong reservations about the ethical validity of the regulations. They are based on weak evidence from a single study, which is currently being widely debated by the scientific community. They are also contrary to a number of key WMA ethical statements and declarations, and as such, we are calling for the immediate withdrawal." So that's the statement, and that statement is going to have broad and sweeping implications if doctors comply with it. And so to complicate the matter even further, just like the WMA states, the evidence that the IAAF used didn't seem to be robust enough to justify substantial empirical evidence. That's another issue that we talk about a little in the podcast. Now, in staunch defense of Caster Semenya, one has to have great empathy for her. She did absolutely nothing wrong. And in this day and age of performance enhancement, and every time you turn a corner, another athlete is determined to have used performance enhancing drugs, she, on the other hand, did absolutely nothing wrong but live her life, train hard, and perform well on her natural abilities. So we have nothing but great compassion for her and all athletes like her. And I personally want to see all of them continue to compete. So why cover a topic such as this that has incited passionate debate on all sides? So, well, first, when I decided to start a podcast, this is precisely the type of subject that I wanted to cover. Real world topics that have foundations in the science of self-propelled motion. This is what we always talk about. What does the science say? And not just the typical training and nutrition, quote unquote, how-to content that saturates the market of health and fitness podcasts and blogs and such. Of course, we'll have some of that too, but I only wanted to do this if I could do it my way, which is find a niche that provides listeners something more thought-provoking and incites intellectual discussion on the tangency of sport. So it's fair to say that this issue, which fell in our lap over the last couple of weeks, fits this mold perfectly of the topics that we want to cover and discuss on the endurance experience. Second, after reading some of the commentary and reaction thus far of people on both sides of this debate, I'm certain that people are coming to the conversation with passion and emotion that is causing both sides to miss some very key points and make some very critical errors in reasoning. Most what I've seen are two main issues, but specifically there's the problem of what's called confirmation bias. And this is where someone is so emotionally fueled on their position that they only consider information that agrees with their view, and they completely ignore all of the information that disagrees with it. And so this is very common when you have passionate positions like the ones that occur on both sides of this discussion. Another common error that has the tendency to be put forth is what's called negative evidence. And to simplify what that is, negative evidence is the type of argument that says what should be there but isn't, right? And then the person will actually use that as proof for their position. So, as an example, the type of example of negative evidence would be something like, well, if DSD athletes have such a performance advantage, why don't we see gold medals from every single DSD athlete that competes? So, I mean, that's just one example of negative evidence, but we've seen that on both sides of the debate, right? Negative evidence, right? So what should be there but isn't, and using that as some form of justification. So to be clear, the goal of this podcast is not to express some formal opinion by me or anyone else, but rather to objectively discuss the science, and perhaps the listeners on either side will come away with a sort of mental firmware upgrade. And instead of telling people what to think, I'm always more interested in helping people just show them how to think, right? So what I'm seeing generally is just a lack of willingness to step back and take an unemotional, detached survey of the facts and the science without immediately jumping to allegations of bigotry, racism, sexism, etc. And maybe as the listener, you might come away with some different understanding and aspect of the issue, or, say to yourself, wow, I never thought of that. Or, certainly you'll be better prepared to avoid some of the common errors in reasoning. So now I'm a coach in the purest sense of the word, in that I have experience training and coaching athletes for competition with other athletes. And I only tease that out because these days everyone seems to be calling themselves a coach now, but that's a different podcast for a different day. So I have a background also as an analyst and in data science. So I'm no stranger to the empirical part of conversations like these. But even still, I wouldn't even consider doing a podcast about such a sensitive topic without bringing on an expert. I do think this is another misstep of some people talking about this and not taking on this very immensely complicated and sensitive topic without some scholarship, instead of just tossing around some opinion grenade on social media, in vlogs on YouTube and such. Insofar as it is possible, we'll always look to my Event Horizon Endurance Sport Networks, our extended performance team, or other experts that we can call upon to help us unpack some of the key facts and circumstances when we have podcasts. So, with that being said, my guest today is Dr. Maria de Boef Miara. She holds a master's degree and a PhD in biology from McGill University. She's a postdoc fellow at Harvard, and she's the director of the Brandeis Human Performance Lab. And so her research aims to understand how competing functional demands, inherited differences, and environmental variations interact to produce musculoskeletal structure and biomechanical functions in humans. She's a wife, a mother, and also a pretty good marathon runner in her own right. We have a very interesting conversation. We talk about evolutionary underpinnings behind something called sexual dimorphism, which explains physical differences in men and women and helps shed light on the question of why we have protected classes in women's sports. We discussed the ranges of testosterone for men and women and other perceived differences in physical performance. We talk a little bit about the Michael Phelps / Michael Jordan comparisons that have come up. That is, why haven't we seen regulations on their genetic differences? And I explain why I think this argument is highly problematic. And we touch a little on how the ruling for DSD athletes might impact or change rules for male to female transgender athletes, which is an entirely different issue. We don't want to conflate that with DSD athletes, but it's related in that the regulations of the IAAF may change some of the regulations for transgendered athletes, given that the regulatory bodies generally fall lockstep with each other. So, that was a pretty long preface, but without further delay, I give you Dr. Maria de Boef Miara. Dr. Maria de Boef Miara, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
So if you can, just give us some background on you, your education, and your experience.
Sure, yeah, glad to. I'm, an import from Canada. So I did my PhD at McGill there, looking at bone physiology, and then came to the Boston area to do a postdoc looking at muscle physiology. Also sort of have a personal interest in athletics, so a marathon runner, distance runner. And sort of with all of that put together, I teach classes on evolution, but then also on human physiology and sports physiology, both at Harvard and at Brandeis. And as you've said, at Brandeis, we're in the process of establishing the Brandeis Human Performance Lab, where we hope to teach our students about Brandeis or about human physiology, and also work with the student athletes here to improve their performances.
Excellent. All right. So I'm going to just give a quick outline for the listeners on the chronology of the events here. And so there's been a lot of political rhetoric and a lot of fiery and emotional feelings with respect to this decision. And so let's just go through the timeline of events, which really stem back about 10 years. So, following performance results, Caster Semenya, who is a very good mid-distance runner from South Africa, the IAAF, which is the International Association of Athletics Federations, said they were obligated to investigate claims, and so they required her to take what's called the sex verification test. And she was subsequently allowed to keep any awards that she received, and the results of the test were never published. But there were subsequent leaks to that test. So all of that happened in 2009, and then in 2010, the IAAF cleared her to compete, and the results of the test were still not released. So she went on to race amid public debates about race and gender and identity politics, and so it got pretty quiet after that, and then nothing really happened for about 5 years. And in 2015, the IAAF's policy on natural levels of testosterone in women were suspended by the Court of Arbitration for Sport due to inefficient evidence. So they said, look, you're going to have to come back with better evidence for your rule. And the CAS gave them 2 years to prove their case for their rule. And this was in July 2015. And so last year in April, the IAAF announced new rules requiring hyperandrogynous athletes to take medication to lower testosterone beginning in November 2018. And they specifically provided evidence only for the 400 meters, 800 meters, and then the 1500 meters. And so this led people to think, well, is this targeted to Caster Semenya? And so in July of 2018, Caster Semenya announced that she would legally challenge the CAS on the basis of fairness, and her hearings began in February 2019, and then just this month, just a couple weeks ago, the CAS rejected her challenge, and so that caused a great amount of concern and a great amount of emotion. People claiming racism, people claiming gender discrimination or sexism, and so my thought with the podcast was to bring someone who really knows about the science behind the difference between males and females, and really sort of tease out, take an emotionally detached step away, and really try to tease out some of the science here. So I was wondering if we could start with the science behind what's called sexual dimorphism, which is the reason why humans, male and female, are different, and some of the evolutionary underpinnings of sexual dimorphism, and then we can then talk about how that requires or maybe calls for differences in classifications in sport.
Right. Yeah. So whenever we see, if we're talking just about organisms in general, just any organisms, when we see a sexually reproducing organism, when we're not just sort of budding off identical clones to ourselves, but we're reproducing sexually, then often there is sort of an unequal contribution from the two different sexes. We call them male and female.
Right.
That starts at the cell level, right? So there's the eggs and sperm are different. And what that leads to is ultimately you have a different investment in the offspring. And when you have a different investment in the offspring, then things are not balanced, right? So even at the level of the cell, the egg is larger and contributes, all sorts of nutrients and different components of the cell to the organism, to the future offspring. And the sperm is really just carrying the genes. And so because we start off with this unequal investment, then that sort of leads to, it's kind of like once you invest in a company, you want to continue investing in its success, right?
Right.
And it's sort of this thing with males and females in that case, and this is true in all organisms, that when one is investing more, then that will lead to a continuation of that greater investment. And so then you end up with this dynamic where in many cases it's beneficial for the female to continue investing in some way, whereas it's more beneficial for the male to try to have more offspring rather than invest in the current offspring. And this is why you see more sperm compared to eggs and that kind of thing. And the way that different organisms deal with this is very, very different. Some will be, humans are for the most part monogamous, and so the differences in that investment is actually quite small in humans compared to other organisms. And so for that reason, when we look at the sexual dimorphism in humans, while we see it as pretty large, because we tend to think of males and females often as very different, it's actually quite small compared to a lot of other organisms. If we look at our most closely related species, so things like gorillas and chimpanzees, the differences between males and females in those species is much larger.
Right.
But the differences are there, and that has to do with the difference in the investment. So in mammals and in humans, the women have to, be pregnant and nurse the offspring, and that takes certain physiological differences that mean that the bodies look and are structured somewhat differently. And so if you're going to have that kind of difference, then you're going to have, ways to signal the body to build itself differently as you're developing.
Right.
And the way that we signal that in our bodies is through hormones. And so one of the hormones, which is the one in question in this case, of course, is testosterone.
Right. So when we look at species, across species, human, mammal, whenever we see, is this true, or you can correct me if I'm wrong, so when we see a species where the male is substantially bigger than the female, is that a signal that that species evolved under harem mating conditions in its past?
It can be, yeah. So it can be. So there's what we're talking about there is what's known as sexual selection, right? Where some where one of the two sexes, it's to their benefit to try to mate with a different number of their counterparts. And so when we talk about sexual selection, it means that not everybody's going to get to reproduce at the same rate in the next generation, and there's some competition happening there. And
right.
That competition can happen either between individuals of the same sex, so either
right.
males competing with males or females competing with females. And in that case, we call it intersexual selection because it's between individuals of intrasexual selection because it's between individuals of the same sex. Or it can be sexual selection like we see with the peacock, right, where one sex is choosing who gets to reproduce in the next generation. And that's intersexual selection.
Got it.
And both of those things can lead to really big sexual dimorphism like the peacock, right? The intersexual selection, the male peacock's tail is hugely different from the females, for instance.
Yeah. So in your example of the gorillas and looking at primates is very interesting just because they're the closest cousins to humans. So the bigger males, the more dominant males, could potentially command more mates, and therefore natural selection pressure pushes them to just be bigger, right, and stronger, right? So So we see a lot of intrasexual selection in things like gorillas and chimpanzees. Right. Okay.
But those are not as monogamous as humans are, for instance.
Right. Okay.
So that's why it's a difference in them than in us.
So, and I think this is important just because whenever you see these debates and conversations in a public square, no one really starts here, because I think you almost necessarily have to start here to really understand why we have, going into sport, why we have protective classes, right? Because obviously, if you just had everybody compete in the same class, like it was some, in like a Game of Thrones type of, competition among humans, where first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth goes to whoever can get those positions, then what you'd see potentially is you'd see the humans that have some of the traits that have been developed as a result of sexual dimorphism. You'd see them sort of dominate some of the high level positions when it comes to things like absolute strength or absolute speed and things like that. So maybe we can talk about some of those things. So what are the results of that make current humans different as a result of sexual dimorphism? Thanks.
In terms of the performance in sports.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so when we are looking, and this is a case in running, so in short and middle distance running, and it also extends into longer distances as well. But in lots of sports, right? Most sports are separated into men and women. We do see in the running, we see a big difference in the performances, 10, 15%, depending on the event that we're talking about.
Right.
And that difference is large enough that if we put everybody in the same grouping, then the women would never really be able to place, or wouldn't be so far behind that it would make no sense for them to compete, right?
Exactly.
And so that, I mean, and we look at this as men and women as two separate classes, but I would also remind people that there are other sports that use other things as well as that. So, there's plenty of sports that have weight classes because they recognize that being of a certain size, regardless of whether you're male or female, has an advantage. And so it's not, men and women is the most ubiquitous difference that we use for lots of sports. There's other sports that use other things as well. Right,
and that's a good example. Boxing, mixed martial arts have weight classes, and another great example is the Paralympics, right? So Paralympics has something like 70 classes, right, for challenged athletes. So someone might have, cerebral palsy. There are different impairments based upon the classes, right? So there are people that have, strength issues. There are people that have, difficulty, running uphill, things like that. So there are different classifications of impairments in Paralympics, and so there's the same exact thing. There are rules set up and governing bodies set up so that they can create those classifications and enforce them. So the frequent argument that we've been seeing in the public sphere is Michael Phelps, where people are saying, well, how come they don't regulate Michael Phelps because he has super flexible feet and he has long arms and he has low lactic acid buildup? And to me, this is just really an invalid argument, right? Because we don't have protective classes for swimmers with short arms or non-flexible feet or short swimmers. So that, to me, is clearly a flawed argument. But we have protective classes for male-female, for boxers and MMA fighters, for physically challenged athletes. And so if there are governing bodies that have those protected classes, we have to, or they have to, enforce those classes. They have to, all right? So that's one of the arguments that's out in the public sphere that I continue to see that is to me not a valid argument. So with I don't know if do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say if we were to see, like, hypothetically, if we were to look at our swimmers and see that they, there were two sort of big groups of swimmers, right? The swimmers with long arms, say, and the swimmers with short arms, then you could imagine that it would make sense for the governing bodies to decide that we should have these two classes for different level types of swimmers. But it's much more of a continuous trait, and also I think we've recognized that individuals like Michael Phelps that have these particular suite of characteristics are somewhat unique, and so if we were to create those kinds of classes, well, then there'd be Michael Phelps, and then and maybe a few people, and then everyone else, and so it's not sort of a meaningful competition at that point, and that's something that the IAAF keeps referring to they're trying to ensure fair and meaningful competition, which is an extremely high bar to reach. I think that's the challenge, right? Is that you have to decide what that means.
Right, exactly. And we don't have the short NBA, right? So any NBA player that's below 6 feet tall, but if they ever did, create such a league, someone would have to create rules, and then governing bodies would enforce them. So I think you're right on target with that. So based upon some of the developments here, Caster Semenya has basically three options. She can continue to race the 800 and 1500, but she would have to, under the new requirements, she would have to take medication to reduce her testosterone below 5 nanomoles per liter for at least 6 months, or have surgery. Or she could run distances not covered by the regulation. She could go down to 200, up to 3,000, up to 5,000, or she could just retire and do something else. So obviously testosterone is the thing that they're keying on. So what is your understanding of the ranges of testosterone for males and females?
Yeah. So the difference is really 10 to 100 times, just to put that out there, because sometimes it's hard to imagine numbers, right, when we're just sort of saying them out loud. But the ranges in women then are about 0.05 to about 2 nanomoles per liter.
Okay.
So 0.05 to about 2, roughly. And then in men, we see it to be roughly around 8 to about 30 nanomoles per liter. So that's a big difference. There's definitely a gap in there. That all of that said, that doesn't mean that there's nobody in the middle, and that's exactly where Caster Semenya is in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can kind of see now where this problem is developing, is that if you're using testosterone as your guide to determine who can compete in which class, then for most people that will work, because you choose a number in the middle, which is what they've done. And most people would either be above or below that by a fairly significant number. But that doesn't mean that there's nobody in the middle, and there are people in the middle, and that's where Caster Semenya is.
So that's pretty significant. So you said that the upper range for females is, did you say 2.5?
So, so in the general population, most women are going to be below 2.
Below 2.
Now, there's plenty of women who have different medical conditions. So, for instance, women with polycystic ovarian syndrome, which
right.
is a fairly common thing, they can, if we look at the 99% of women, including those with polycystic ovarian syndrome, then you're getting up close to 5.
Right.
So already those women are above that limit that they've set.
So that's pretty significant. So the upper limit for most women is substantially below the lower limit for males, substantially below.
Yeah.
And so that means, probably over 90% of women fall within that range. That's and so
yeah.
It makes sense that in order for a woman to decrease their testosterone, that they would have to go on medication, or have surgery in order to get it that low. So now, so that makes sense. So the way that XY, someone has an XY chromosome, and and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, on the Y chromosome there is the critical gene that sends the signal to the body, the phenotype, to become male, right? So that means male characteristics, testicles, testosterone, male reproductive organs, and from there, all of the characteristics like muscle mass, shape, that all of that stems from there. Am I describing that right?
Yeah, no, I would agree with much of what you said there. So yeah, the gene, it's really, a lot of people point at the SRY gene, although there's a few others as well, is the one that sort of starts this domino effect that influences lots of different things in the body, including testosterone levels, to create those, what we call secondary sex characteristics.
Okay.
The dimorphisms that we were talking about.
Right. Okay, so that's why everything is so targeted on testosterone. It's sort of like testosterone doesn't guarantee that you're going to have performance, but it's what is needed to reach the really high level of performance that males see. So it's sort of like the average NFL lineman is 300 pounds, 6'5". So being 300 pounds doesn't guarantee that you're going to perform like an NFL lineman. But in order to actually get into the NFL, get into the door, you need to approximately have those characteristics. So it's sort of like that. So. I wouldn't be able to go into the elite women's field and beat any of them, even though
Right.
even though my testosterone is higher. It's sort of like there is a hypothetical possibility of superior performance or abnormal performance. But for many reasons, the athlete may or may not realize that performance.
Yeah, I would add another layer to this, which is in order for any hormone or signaling molecule to have any kind of function in the body to do what it needs to do, we need to have receptors on our cell that will bind to that hormone.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have much of that hormone circulating in your body as you want, but unless the receptors are there and functioning properly, it's not gonna, that signal's not going to work. So for instance, these hormones are kind of acting like, radio waves out in the environment, but unless you tune your radio to the right station, you're not gonna get the signal. And so if the cells are not able to tune to the right signal, if they don't have receptors for that hormone, they're not going to respond to that hormone. And that's sort of one of the problems here, right, is that you can look at the testosterone levels, but if you're not sure what the testosterone is doing in the body, there's no way to know that it's actually having an effect on these athletes.
Right. So someone could have the elevated testosterone, but for some reason or another, they may not be able to use it.
That's right, yeah.
And this is
exactly what happens in type 2 diabetes, right? Is type 2 diabetics have lots of insulin, but the receptors to that insulin are not working.
Got it.
It's different from type 1 diabetes.
and that just complicates complicates it even more. And so that's the challenge. I think me, from a coaching perspective, I can see that the IAAF definitely has a responsibility to enforce the rules, the protected classes. So the questions that I have are the implementation problems that have arisen. So the World Medical Association issued a statement after Caster Semenya's appeal was rejected. They issued a statement saying that off-label use of testosterone blockers and surgery are unethical, and they recommended that the doctors should not implement the policies. And that's pretty significant. That means that someone, if they desired to be, well, if the doctors carried out that recommendation, that means that if someone wanted to use medication or have surgery, they wouldn't be able to do it because the doctors wouldn't allow them to. That is pretty significant, and that has a whole host of other implications. And so the other thing is, I'm not sure if they completely have the science or the evidence right. So the only evidence they had, the IAAF brought forward, was on a handful of events, the 400, the 800, and so I think a thought experiment would be, if you could devise a perfect test for this, how would you do it? I mean, it's not really there's not an easy answer on how to devise a better test for whether or not DSD athletes outperform, and if they were to go on medication to reduce testosterone, would their performance drop? How do you devise a test to show the difference?
Yeah, I don't think we're at the point with our sort of scientific knowledge or testing abilities to be able to do that. And I think the reason that they're using testosterone is because of this big difference between men and women, and because we know some of the effects of testosterone can be related to performance, right? It increases your muscle mass. It can, change your cardiac performance. There's lots of different things that it does that would hypothetically improve your sports performance. Mm-hmm. And so if you have this hormone, that we can link to that, and then we can also say, well, there's this big difference with this gap in the middle between most men and most women. That's sort of the easiest thing that they have so far. But as we've been saying, it's much more complicated than that. Testosterone isn't the only thing, and also the way that it's affecting the body can vary from person to person, regardless of its levels.
Yeah. I can think of so many things. I mean, hemoglobin, skeletal strength and skeletal structure, lean body mass, cardiovascular capacity. These are all things that are not even really touched, and so they're only looking at testosterone. And if you could do sort of an Einsteinian thought experiment and say, if you could do magic, how would you devise a test? And I'm thinking, if I had groups of athletes, of DSD athletes, from the 100 meters to the marathon, and I could analyze all of their performance, and then I had the same exact groups post medication and or surgery, and then analyze their performance then and look at the difference. That would be a way that you could do it, but that would be impossible to implement.
Yeah, that would be very unethical. Well, and the other challenge, I think, too, is what you're looking at is the effect of the testosterone in those moments, right? In what happens when you're losing the testosterone compared to when you had it before. But the problem is that testosterone is having an effect not only in the months with the training prior to that particular event, but also it's been having an effect that person's entire life, right? And so the way that their skeleton developed, the way that their cardiovascular system developed was all influenced by the level of all of these hormones in their body as they were growing and developing. And the muscular system is pretty plastic. It changes a lot relative to the amount of training you're doing, but the skeleton, not as much. And the cardiovascular system does change. But again, there's some baseline that's there from what you were doing as a kid and as a teenager. Mm-hmm. And that was all influenced by the level of hormone in your body at that point in your life, and you can't take that back.
Right. Okay. So, looking at everything with respect to this, so this issue is probably going to continue to be talked about, and it's going to bleed over. I think some of it will bleed over to all of the issues relating to transgender athletes. I mean, you could even have a completely new podcast on this topic, right? So there are the male to female athletes, people who have transitioned, and right now they used to require surgery before, and then that changed, and then now for transgendered athletes, you only have to prove that your testosterone was below, for them it was 10 nanomoles per liter. This will the Caster Semenya decision might bleed over to that, and they now may have to, who knows, we'll see, but they're almost certainly that's probably going to change to 5 nanomoles per liter. But people often will conflate these two. They are completely separate, and so, and then obviously there were very big athletes, like Paula Radcliffe, the female marathon world record holder, Martina Navratilova, Sharon Davies, and various MMA fighters have all come out and said, they should protect women's sports. There needs to be rules to protect women's sports. So that caused some conversation. So I wonder if we can talk about this in the world of science, the word sex versus gender, and do these words cause confusion over transgender athlete participation in sport?
I think that this is a really challenging topic to discuss and to discuss scientifically, but the challenge, of course, is that none of this is happening in a bubble, right? We're influenced by the society that we live in, and gender is really, a societal concept, right? It's how we fit within society is our gender, and can be, and it's not this binary thing that we've been thinking about. It historically has been it's been binary, but in reality it's not necessarily, right? So,
right.
But what sport is facing is that in sport we've decided that we have these two classes, and it is binary. And so how do you sort of mold this non-binary social construct into this binary framework? And I think that is a really challenging thing. And I think on top of that, you add the layers of how, right, this is an international, right? The I in IAAF stands for international. This is an international body that's making decisions for all sorts of different people with different feelings and different societies and different societal influences on what all of this means. And so that is also adding to this layer. But in terms of what science sees as gender, I think that science doesn't typically say much about gender because that's more of a sociology question.
Right.
When science is talking about is more along the sex aspect, and there we do talk a lot more about what we see in terms of biological sex, and biological sex is, we typically think of it in binary terms, but then we also recognize that there are individuals that have some characteristics of one sex and some characteristics of the other sex, or somewhere in between. And so that when we're talking on the individual level, it's not necessarily binary either. And so again, all of this to say that we have this binary structure in athletics, but it doesn't fit with the reality of what we're seeing for either sex or gender, either biologically or socially.
Right. And I envision some of the challenge challenges to test this, right? So it's the same thing. How do you test someone who has transitioned after puberty? How do you test that post their hormone replacement therapy or whatever treatments that they went through? How do you test that any advantage that they would have had diminishes post treatment? That's a very hard thing to test scientifically.
It is very hard. And ultimately what they need to do is create some sort of rules that work for everybody, but I mean, it seems like an impossible task. And
that's in it, and it's never gonna be perfect. And and then on top of that, you have a very sensitive public where everything is sort of conflated with either sexual discrimination, racial discrimination, and things like that. And then on top of that, you have some of the athletes that have spoken out, and female athletes. I think some of the female athletes have been some of the most vocal because obviously if you're a competitive athlete, certainly an elite athlete, then it's almost like you have more skin in the game when you're trying to feed your family, trying to win races and get sponsorships and things like that. So I can see that complexity coming in.
I mean, I think if we agree that we should have these two classes, and I think that that's maybe one of the few things that people generally agree about, then we have to figure out how we place people in these two categories. But given that people are not binary in this way, that's hard.
Right. And so I think, I sort of look at it like, okay, we have to have a conversation and try to come to the table with an emotionally detached perspective, trying to tease out what's right, what still needs more research, and not immediately jump to the very hyperbolic and inflamed reactions. And I think being able to do this, what we've done here, right? You have someone, a researcher and a scholar in these matters, and yourself, and you have a coach, you have a male, female, black, white, right? But we can still come together and say, okay, what are the facts? What are the problems, right? And this is important. I think people are just not doing that. They're too emotionally invested and immediately jump to really hyperbolic conclusions here.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I keep thinking about myself is that the other thing that's happening here is they're changing the rules mid-game for some of these people, right?
Right.
So for Caster Semenya, who has worked so hard to get to where she is and has been very successful, now they're changing the rules, and that also doesn't feel very fair.
Right, and I feel for her. I feel for her, too, because if I were in her shoes, I didn't do anything wrong. She didn't do anything wrong. She didn't do anything wrong. She followed the rules as
they were in place, and she did everything she needed to do, and now the rules are changing.
And the rules are changing, and so it makes sense that she's upset, and then people are upset for her, and I definitely feel that, too. And I hope we continue to see her, right? If it sounds like she's not going to do the medical treatments or interventions, she most likely will try to run something else. But we'll see. But I hope to continue to see her compete. The other thing is this population of DSD athletes. It's a very small population. I read that it was something like, less than 2%, maybe 1% of the population, 1.5% of the population, or something like that. So what we're looking at is a very small percentage of athletes, yet, like you said, the implications of what you do with that small population bleed into other issues, like how they deal with male to female athletes, people who transition from male to female. So, all right. Well, I think we pretty much touched everything. This is a great conversation, and I think we definitely would have to have some more follow-up conversation. I mean, we could go on, an hour on several of these topics that we touched. But I think it would be great one day to have you back on the podcast and continue the discussion here.
Yeah, I'd love to.
All right. So the director of the Brandeis Human Performance Lab, Dr. Maria de Boef Miara. Thank you for coming on to the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I will closely follow the developments of this issue, and we almost certainly have to do a follow-up or part 2 to this podcast as we're aware of new developments. I'd like to get intersexed or transgendered athletes who would be willing to offer their perspective. So if you're out there, you can reach out to me at contact@eventhorizon.tv. For now, I'd say that it's hard to argue against the fact that the IAAF does have the responsibility to draw boundaries and enforce them to ensure fairness, just like other sports do with weight classes and impairments of physically challenged athletes that compete. However, like the WMA, I'm also not convinced that the IAAF met the standard of research to justify the ruling. The IAAF's ruling was based on their own study and not a high-quality one. The best science is independent, peer-reviewed research with randomized controlled trials insofar that that's possible. And so researchers will be challenged to formulate a good experimental test to disprove the hypothesis that DSD athletes have an unfair advantage. And science is an arms race, and because of that, we can only hope that the forces of independent analysis are working to outdo each other right now, and will eventually shed some light on this complicated subject. So I'd like to thank my guest, Dr. Maria de Boef Miara. This is the Endurance Experience.
Follow Event Horizon Endurance Sport on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter for training programs and services. To become a member of our Endurance Institute or for a complete archive of podcasts, log on to our website, eventhorizon.tv.